So today's session, this panel discussion is going to be about serious games. Just as a quick poll of the audience, how many of you have heard of serious games? Is anybody involved in serious games? Is anybody making games, serious games, stuff like that? Okay, not very many. See a lot of confused faces. This is the Casual Connect. People, this is the Casual Connect, right? Yay, Casual Connect. We represent serious games. If there was ever a polar opposite of Casual Connect, it would be the Serious Games Summit. We are making a stand for this. We are the 300 in that sense. I have a great panel with me, friends, new and old, who are all have been working for a lot of experience working in the serious games industry. What I'm going to do initially is I'm going to, just to start this off, start with introducing each person, get a chance to hear about who they are, what they've done so far. Just keep that short, just get on with that, and then we'll get into what each of the industries represented here within the serious games industry is. We can ask a few questions about that. At any point in time, if you're a member of the audience, this panel discussion is for you. So at any point in time you have a question, other than, can I have lunch, or where's the restroom? For those kinds of questions, there's like lunch is outside and restroom is on the right. But if any question about what the panel is talking about, please raise your hands. I'll be looking at you most of the time, and the idea is to make this as interactive and entertaining as possible. Okay, to start off, right here, I have Brenton Burchmore, and he is basically representing educational games here today. And so, Brenton, a few words about yourself.
Thanks, Sid. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. What we talk about when we talk about games that teach is serious games in principle is games that have some extra purpose beyond simply having a bit of fun. And educational games, it's a bit of a double whammy, because one of the things we've come to understand is that every game teaches something. And at Comperia, what we're trying to do is have a game design philosophy, and to help, whether it be trainers, corporate trainers, whether it be schools, universities, whether it be individuals, to understand how games can teach something. So what we've done in the past, we've done a lot of university design work. We've created courses and master's programs, and we've done a lot of online learning design for universities and for corporations. But we've also done a lot of game design. So I'm an avid gamer myself. I was asked once how many hours I think I've put together in games, and I think the answer would probably be somewhere in about 15,000 hours of online game time. Yeah. So, combining that with a career in technology and teaching, what we're trying to do is make the most of it and bring it all together. So we're doing a lot of training to train developers in how to think in terms of making games that teach, but also helping the teachers, the trainers, the educators to make use of games in a new and innovative way, and merging the thing, but most of all, making sure that it is not fun by accident, that it is fun first. It's about making fun educational rather than trying to make education fun.
Excellent. Next up, we have Jeremiah Alexander, who is going to talk about games and arts and culture as a vertical. Jeremiah?
Thank you. So I'm a games developer who I think accidentally became a serious games developer probably about 8 years ago. So I started doing games, so I studied games development, and then from there I decided to set up my own business. And since then I've kind of programmed and developed games on everything, web, apps, even interactive teddy bears. It's all sorts of randomness. And so talking about what serious games means, if we were to go at the Wikipedia definition, it would be games where the primary purpose is not entertainment. But if I reflect on why I got into it, I think it was just because I wanted to make something that was meaningful. So I wanted to make games which had a real impact on people's lives. And eventually I kind of discovered that that was being branded as serious games or edutainment or the various other types of label. And I suppose over the years, when I reflected on that, I just wanted to create stuff that was meaningful. It became a much broader categorization and perhaps a bit more ambiguous. So it's only natural that most recently I've drifted into doing lots of stuff in the arts and cultural space where, again, it's perhaps less rigid in terms of trying to adhere to assessments or trying to teach stuff which is very tangible. So how do you teach, how do you evaluate how engaged someone is with a historic collection from a museum or a gallery? It's difficult to tell. So I suppose that, yeah, my interest has always been about creating stuff which was meaningful, and from that I've ended up doing a lot of stuff in arts and culture, and that's been reinventing school tours as transmedia games through to geocaching, content from archives, and most recently been working at connecting grandparents and grandchildren over shared interests such as Roman history. So yeah, I suppose that's my angle.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Next up, we have Karen. Karen is going to talk about financial literacy and games. It's one of the very strong pillars of the serious games industry. Karen, a little bit about Play Moolah. And
thanks, Sid, for the introduction. So I'm Karen. I lead product at Play Moolah. So we're an innovation company that basically combines digital, community, and educational experiences to teach children, young adults, and youth financial literacy. So the premise is that our mission really is very much about putting money in its place for personal fulfillment, collective transformation, to basically enable people to realize how money can actually help them achieve their goals, and also for their personal fulfillment. I think how it started because we found that it was, the seeds were planted actually back in 2008. This was in Silicon Valley, San Francisco. And it was during the worst financial crisis. And we realized that a lot of our peers did not know anything very much about financial literacy. So that was how we got started. And because we found that money relationships, that most people's money relationships is actually fraught with a lot of inaction, lack of knowledge, and fear. So we want to get people to talk about it, and also using game design to get them to trigger awareness, action, and inspire these kind of money conversations amongst people. So that's how we got started.
Thanks, Karen. Next up, we have Beo, and Beo is going to represent the healthcare side of games, and games have a huge impact in healthcare. Not just as something that gets people to take medicines, but much more than that, as therapy as well. So Beo, a little bit about yourself, the awesome work you do in healthcare.
Okay, thanks, Sid. Okay, my name is Beo. Started out many years ago as a hardcore techie. I have not done programming since. I think last 20 years, right? So in between, gone into business, started some businesses, some successful, many closed down. Invested in some, same thing. But fortunately, enough to now fund my interest and passion in serious games, right? Because I think all of you know, developing games is challenging, okay? And serious games, even more so, right? So with all the experience that I have coming together, the company that I represent now, Immersive Play, we basically do serious games. We target preschool children, something as diverse as teaching them music in a fun way, stress management, anger management with the Institute of Mental Health, and as Sid mentioned, getting into health-based serious games, which I think we'll highlight later on is really one of the toughest areas to get into, right? But overall, for myself, I believe a lot in platforms. Right, platforms working together with other game developers, partners, and effectively really hunting as a pack, because it can be very lonely out there for game developers. So I would really like to, I guess, later on talk a lot more about how we can come together on open platforms and work together in specific areas, as I said, in healthcare, preschool education, and so on, right? Thanks.
Just to talk a little bit about myself, I'm the creative director at Playbear Studios. Playbear is a serious games company primarily looking right now at corporate training. There is a huge wave nowadays that's basically getting corporates to move away from conventional style instructor-led training as well as e-learning and into the field of training with games. Especially with mobile games, there's a lot of opportunities opening up for developers to look at building games for companies that train people to do things. So it can be as simple as training a plumber how to do actual plumbing while he's playing a game on a mobile, to something like teaching stockbrokers, trading, or even working with banks. We work with military, healthcare as well, corporates, basically corporate training, where there is an institution, it has a message, it has to spread across to its audience. That's what Playbear is interested in. So if you have any specific questions about, if you found something that one of the speakers said interesting already and you have a question that is specifically directed to any one of the speakers, please feel free to ask them. If not, I'm going to go on and I'm going to basically now ask each person a question to just start off talking about some of the specific opportunities and challenges in each of the areas that they represent. Just as so that we don't keep doing the same, conveyor belt kind style again. If anybody wants to go first, you can raise. Does anybody want to go first? One of you guys?
Right.
Okay.
Everyone's looking at me. So I think I better start.
So, Sangbeo, my question would be, I think one of the things that you sort of kind of alluded to that was very interesting, what you just said, is that games can be more in healthcare, and it's a very challenging field. So what are some of the opportunities for games in the field of healthcare? What are some of the ways in which games can be used in healthcare?
Okay. Let me just, I guess, talk about the specific areas that I'm in, right? Because that's the area that I'm involved in, right? So I think I mentioned about anger, stress management. So even though it may not look like directly related to healthcare, but really in Singapore, we are seeing an increasing number of children who, of course, are stressed and have anger management issues, right? So, so part of what we're doing now is that we're developing apps and games to help the children to better manage their stress, teach them about tools and ways that they can then manage the stress and anger, even to the extent of integrating wearables so that we can detect the moment when they have the stress and then prompt them to then take action to then lower it, right? The other area that I'm involved in, I mean, maybe just a step back. So all of you would probably like to know where and how do I get the money to do that, right? So a lot of the work we do is funded by research grants, right? So in this case, part of it was through NRF, and at the moment now, the work we're doing is through a research grant that the hospital group themselves have, right? But ultimately, the monetization model that we have is that we will license this game back from the hospital group itself, and then, of course, we will then put it up on the App Store to counselors, to schools, to MOEs, and so on, to then make the money back, right? So, of course, as part of the research funding, we can't charge a lot of money, right? So because basically it's cost recovery. So further down the line, hopefully in 1 year's time, 2 years' time, that's where the profits will come back down, okay? Now, the other area that we are in, as I mentioned, I'm a great believer in platforms, right? So we have started a company that is developing a platform for wellness, right? So I think you have seen the App Store where people play games to enjoy themselves. So we are starting a platform for people to have access to games that will then help them in terms of rehab, right? So I think you've seen recently in Singapore a lot of issues about how to help the elderly, the seniors maintain a healthy lifestyle and things like that. So the platform is that. So it's an open platform. So we're getting a lot of interest from, strangely, academics and universities, because a lot of the initial games developed for healthcare are all done really by academics, hospitals, researchers, rather than, I guess, people like you and me. Okay, so they spend tons of money doing that, but a lot of times the actual game itself doesn't get commercialized. Okay, so if you look at some opportunities, that's where we're coming in. That means we would set up a platform. Most of these games that they spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars going through field trial testing to make sure that it works, never gets commercialized. And part of its reason is because the interface itself is not that great, right? So what we're hoping to do is to bridge that gap as well, where developers like yourself can come in, license those research that's been done, make it a lot more attractive, but with the underlying field trials, efficacy research, the data that's in there, and then make it commercial on the platform.
I think that was a very interesting thing. Actually, I was going to ask the same question, I think.
Simka, I was just going to ask, you're talking about therapy as a game outcome. You're not just talking about a cathartic outlet. Because, I mean, I know for myself, I always feel better after half an hour of blowing up stuff. All right? Shooting some digital bad guys, and I feel a bit more relaxed. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about some specific therapeutic outcomes that are targeted at people that need or want something that in particular. Is that the case? You're more specific than that.
That's right. So really in terms of wellness, we're talking about two areas. One is mental, right, which includes social integration, being able to go on the network, having friends, but also in terms of the degree of cognitive capability, right, onset of dementia and things like that, right? The other one is physical, which is more challenging, right? Now, in this area, there's a growing research and development called rehab at home, right? Basically, if you need to do rehab in a hospital, you need a caregiver to bring you down, and you have to wait for hours for your turn, and you spend 1 hour at a very expensive piece of machine, right? Now, if you could have something that maybe is, let's say, 80% or 90% of that expensive machine, but you can use it at home, but you can use it every day. Your doctors can monitor you and tell you how you're doing, and the feedback can be there. Your caregiver don't have to then take leave or take half an hour, 1 hour, half a day to bring you down. We believe that it's a lot more effective, right? And at the moment now, there is a $100 million grant that has been established by the government to go in that area. Okay, so certainly a lot of opportunities there.
So $100 million, we'll come back to the $100 million soon. Karen, I would like to ask you that you were talking about financial literacy and how games can influence that. How has your experience been in terms of, I think Beo raised a very important point about business models being different in the serious games field than in the commercial games in general. How has your experience been in terms of business models when it comes to financial literacy? What do you see as different in the serious games industry from conventional games?
Okay, so for Playmula, we've got a couple of business models. Primarily, one of it is actually licensing. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but we had two of our apps. So one was Playmula, Y-Mula, that's for the youth, and Mula Bus, it's for the kids. We're actually originally funded by, respectively, DBS and OCBC. So we started off with these banks because that was one of the ways that they wanted to try to engage their kids and their youth segment. So this was, we see licensing as a very big part of our revenue model. I think one of the things that we found also was that this was not enough. I mean, you can do a lot of online stuff with financial literacy. We also needed the low touch. So we actually came out with things like community circle. This is what we call the honesty circle. It's a community-driven and community initiative. There is no revenue model, but it's basically to serve people, to allow them a safe space to talk about money, just because money is a very taboo subject, even more so than sex, really. So, but there's no revenue in that. But what we found from that was that because it allows us to connect with our users, it's actually also a ground for us to prototype some of the products that we want to do and some of the features that we want to do. We also roll out educational programs, experiential games in schools, just so that we want to be very in touch with the users. So all this, I mean, it's apart from the licensing models, we also have things that programs we do at schools with nonprofit. So you could say that it's literally an array of revenue models. I don't think licensing is the only way to go for us. So there are definitely quite a few opportunities out there.
Yeah. Karen actually raised a pretty interesting point. You worked with DBS Bank and OCBC Bank. I just want to ask a question to Brenton here. Brenton, one of the big challenges that I think all developers face is that when we go and talk to corporates, large corporates like banks, and even as Beo was saying, to hospitals or the government agencies, one of the biggest challenges is how do we speak the same language? I don't know if kind of the hall echoes this question. How does a game development company speak the same kind of language that this big organization is facing? I'm putting the question to Brendan. I'm seeing some smiles. So if you guys feel like jumping in and saying a few words about that as well, because I think as developers, it's extremely challenging to go up to somebody and start talking about games. Often there is an information gap. We know stuff about games that these guys don't know, and there's a lot of stuff about their respective industries that we as developers don't know. So how because you've worked with so many different types of organizations, how do you see what are some advice for developers to try to bridge those gaps?
I think, when we talk about corporates and large organizations, the first thing that pop into their mind will be return on investment. Every dollar they spend, they need to have some way of knowing or believing that they're getting something back for that dollar. And this is where there's, I think, a big growth and overlap in all aspects of game development now, which is coming from analytics. So there's two halves to this question. One is the design of whatever the game is. Is it designed to a purpose? But secondly, what analytics might the game have or be able to show that'll tell us whether or not it's achieving its goals? So the second part of that is something that I think that all aspects of everything from casual games to serious games are already embracing. And having walked around outside and looking at the various offerings out there, there's a lot more discussion about analytics now. And the ability for any form of game to be able to track and report on the microscopic activities within the game, then how you report that back, if it's meant to give fun, you can report that to some extent. If it's meant to create health outcomes, if it's meant to create educational outcomes, you've got a starting point that you can then look to see what it's doing of any kind.
Actually, brings an interesting question in my mind, Jeremiah. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit. Well, when it comes to education, you can look at assessment. When it comes to healthcare, there can be a significant improvement in somebody's, physical or mental health. When it comes to arts and culture, what kind of outcomes do you think game developers can talk about to some of the types of organizations that you've worked with in the past? What are some of the ways in which we can talk about how games can be affected? What has been some of your experience?
So I suppose that's quite a challenging question. I think it's always quite difficult to measure the impact of art or culture on someone's life. I suppose the most easy way, which we kind of end up doing, is just looking at numbers. So as an example, we developed a mobile app working with a archive. So they had loads of content about Victorian history, and they wanted to make that accessible to people who wouldn't come and sit in the archive and look through all the files. So we turned that into a location-based mobile app, and people go around and discover stories. So I suppose that our assessment from that point of view was, well, how many people are we engaging who might not traditionally engage? So how many people go into the archive and sit there and go through the boxes versus how many people downloaded the app and looked at the content in that fashion. So I suppose it's a comparison, but in terms of how meaningful that is, so knowing what Victorian murderers would do, how useful that is for your life, that's a much harder point to argue.
Can I ask you, if you have analytics that is telling you what people are doing in the game, could you draw some conclusions from that?
In
terms of how a person is mentally engaging with that content?
Yes, definitely. So I think that there's, again, something we just see across games is there's a lot of impact in how we design the content. So a point that we're all quite familiar with about serious games is sometimes you can make something a game for game's sake. So again, with the archive content, initially we had it that you had to go to a location to unlock the content. And then what we realized is that people are really lazy, and people didn't want to have to go to every single location to unlock every bit of content. And that was very visible from the statistics, where we could look at the content which was freely available was accessed tenfold for the content which you had to go to the location to unlock. So I think that that's one aspect in terms of improving the design. Another would perhaps be looking at it more from a qualitative point of view, and I think some of the feedback that you can get. So even you put an app on the App Store and the reviews which you'll get on the App Store, I think that that's quite good insight into how engaging the content is. I suppose one example from the same app which was quite funny was we had someone who was a tour guide make a complaint that the app was too good and it was going to put tour guides out of work. So I don't intend to put anybody out of work, but I think that that's quite an interesting bit of feedback that perhaps it is working and it is engaging.
So, just reading the audience, I think we get the most smiles when we talk about money and stuff like that. Everybody is interested in business. I think one candid question I can ask is, and I think some of my experience has been in terms of what budgets look like when you talk to a corporate, in terms of games. In my personal experience, it's quite varied. And it does depend a lot on amount of effort, but people are looking at in terms of how much money that they're going to talk about in terms of spending to kind of achieve that. So I can tell you from a corporate perspective that it sort of ranges. It's similar to e-learning in that sense. Corporates look at the number of hours of engagement that the game's going to provide, and then give a value to that hour, And so in the corporate training, at least, we have the Gurera scale. So we have got 1 hour of training is like about $35,000 in terms of budget. That's what you roughly look at, and depending on what we can talk about in terms of how many hours of training the game can provide, that kind of helps you figure out how much the project's going to cost. So in each of these fields that we are talking about, that we represent here, what are some of the kinds of project sizes, budgets that you can look at least initially to start off with? Of course, everybody wants to do some sort of Candy Crush or Flappy Bird, but that doesn't happen as frequently in serious games. So what are some of your experiences? Talk about a project, about some sort of size in terms of what is an expected revenue, how much time and effort it took. Anyone?
I can start. I think it varies. So it can go with anywhere from 5 figures to 6 figures. A development, I think, will go about 3 months. I think 3 months is actually very, very comfortable. And 3 months, 6 months if the client is actually very nice to give you a lot of time. So this is about the range that you will look at, for us.
Okay. So 5 to 6 figures is high 5 or low 5?
Mid 5s. Though I have to say that was, I think you would obviously have clients that come to you expecting that because you have done something similar and they want you to do it at very, very low cost. And that's something that you have to ask yourself, is that worth it? Because they're not placing a value on the product and the outcomes. So that's where sometimes you see that intention alignment is not there and you walk away It's not just about the money. I think it's also the intention alignment. A lot of them could be coming to you, asking you for something that's fun, and you know that unfortunately, their intentions are not always very clear. For us, it's very, very important. Like for financial literacy, we're very clear that we want people to be to be educated on financial literacy. It's not just about the banks coming to us and telling us that we want our youth to pick up our credit cards and all that. So if there is non-alignment, walk away. No loss.
So, Karen represents, is talking about financial literacy. So banks have a lot of money, obviously. Who else has a lot of money nowadays? Schools have a lot of money, Brenton. So, look at how much private schools charge. What's your experience like in education?
Sometimes the budget comes from an opportunity cost. Okay. So, they have a budget to achieve something and they say, well, we could do it this way or we could do it that way or we could make a game to do it. And sometimes that's the starting point for the conversation, and that sets the tone for how much scope there is for variation and for trying something new and trying something different. And often there begins the troubles, because from that point the compromises begin. And it's a compromise of design, it's a compromise of platform, it's a compromise of depth. So one of the big challenges is that a lot of the time the school or the corporate, they don't really know how it's meant to work. They don't know how it's going to look. They've got an idea of how it might look, and usually that's been coloured by things that have happened before, and they may not have been great ideas. So in some ways, it really is worth stepping back and saying, well, let's take a step back and look at really what are you trying to achieve from this, and is there a way we can reconceptualise this from the ground up and make the right use of this budget? And maybe half a game is an idea, or maybe it's a way of using something else that's out there and putting behind it something else that reviews it, analyses it, collects data in a different way, and has a more of a hybrid approach to it.
I'm going to hold you down to the give me a number kind of talk about a number.
Well, the average, if you look at it in comparison to e-learning, the average online learning course that a university would provide would probably be cost anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 for them to build that. That's their budget for a course. So if you're going to build a game that is meant to replicate the learning outcomes of a subject at a tertiary level, then that's really all they're going to be able to afford to spend to achieve that outcome. If they're going to spend more than that, then they want to be able to leverage it across a number of subjects.
Okay. So the high roller on this table seems to be Beo. He talked about 100 million. Beo, what's your experience with hospitals? We know hospitals charge a lot of money.
Okay. Again, when you go into so-called serious games, they are very much research project and research based, so it typically spans a longer time period. So generally we look at about 100,000 and typically below 250, right? But based on what we mentioned earlier, we have a project that's in the proposal stage now that's about 1.4 million. Wow. So a much longer term, bigger project.
Cool. So Jeremiah, you're the one with the arts and culture thing, right? And with paintings going for $126 million, right? There's lots of money in art as well, right?
There's no money in art at all. So not to be too cynical. Okay. In the UK in particular, I think there's been a lot of funding cuts for the arts sector. So to be honest, I think it depends a lot on the organization that you're working with. So some brands have very deep pockets and they have infinite cash reserves and they're happy to pump in as much money as is required. But if you're working with smaller independents, and they've got only what they've got available, and then it's a choice as to whether that's enough for you to want to do something with it, or whether you're just going to chase the larger pots of money. So in terms of putting numbers to it, again, yeah, I would agree that it's the 5 to 6 figures. So we've done projects from $10,000, up to over 100,000 over. So I think it varies. I think an interesting point about the funding is thinking about the budgets that you're tapping into, which I know is definitely really important in So thinking about some of my experience from the school space, a few years ago I spun off an education tech startup that was trying to use gamification to improve student participation in schools, so give them a voice to share their ideas and opinions. And it was a complete failure. And it wasn't a failure because the product was bad. It was a failure because we were targeting the wrong budgets. So we were looking at what's the school's budget for student voice. And in the UK, it was a teacher working on it in their spare time and perhaps a few £1,000s a year. So whilst we had a great product and we had a great cause that we were trying to champion, we just targeted the wrong budget. So if we had targeted GCSE or A-level results and looked at improving those, or literacy, or one of the bigger pots of funding, then there would have been more money for it. So I think a lot of it is about the budgets that you target.
I think you make a very good point that it's not so much about necessarily the initial design. You can have a great idea and a great initial design, but certainly in my experience with education, where it typically often falls down is in the execution and the delivery. Because in my experience, a lot of the, certainly even today, a lot of the game ideas where we're saying let's gamify or let's put gaming into, it's been done with the intention of gaming to replicate or replace some aspect of the teaching process. But the game really is best used as a teaching aid. It's not really suited to replace the teaching or the educational process. It's a tool. And so when we get the teachers able to understand what role a game has in the teaching process, then they can work with it and then use it as an aid and use it as a leveraging force. And then immediately what the game design needs to do, the bar drops significantly because it doesn't need to do everything. It just needs to be the tool that then the professional is using. And the same thing, I believe, would apply with healthcare, Symbio. It's not meant to replicate what the health professional does. It's meant to be a kind of tool that, because of the engagement you can get with games, will get a student or a patient or a player engaged with something that then the professional can leverage.
At this point, I think I'm going to crowdsource some ideas. I'm going to look at the audience and say, if you guys have questions about serious games industry, specific questions, something that we might have touched on, not really talked about, to the kind of detail that you would like to hear, you know, we'd love to answer some questions. So anybody has a question? Yes. Just
Hi. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kelvin. I'm from Delta Duck Studios. We've recently created a Chinese language learning game. One challenge I found was actually marketing. I think marketing is a big challenge for any company. In terms of like education games, for us, we tied up with like a book publisher. Are there any other things that you've done for marketing that have worked successfully for your site?
I think the good question that comes from that is, what budget are you targeting? And certainly in this region, the budget that most of those sorts of games tend to target is the tuition budget. So this is a budget that's controlled by the parents, and it's to supplement the education of the children. So if your target is that budget, then your decision makers are parents. So your marketing can be through the tuition network, provided it's positioned as a tool to make the tutors do their job better. Because one of the ways in which that sort of game might succeed is if you have tutors that are aware of it, tutors that know that it adds some good things. I mean, my son has Chinese language tuition, but we don't speak it at home. So one of the things that our tutor has done, it's impossible to get him to want to do his Chinese tuition homework when she's gone. But he'll play a game. It might not be the most fun game on his iPad, but he'll play that. That's his compromise. And that has come from the tutor to say, this is, and I bought it as a parent, my budget, guided by the tutor, because that's the ecosystem where that decision gets made.
Okay, thank you very much.
Some of Playware's own experience, my experience has been with, just coming back here. Some of my experience has been with Playware is that when we there is no publishing network for serious games in general. Of course, you can go to book publishers, but the problem with book publishers is that they don't understand very often the online market, and they don't have any sort of clout over it anyways. Some of the things that we try to do in Flavor is basically, in fact, something that Beo was alluding to, and that is work with people. So look, you try to expand your geographies as much as possible, look around, see what are some of the organizations that are already in this field of Chinese language training, and try to work with them directly. And so that might be actually a better way, because they already have access to people who want to train people on learning that language. So depending on whatever age group your game is challenging, if you're for preschoolers, work with some preschools, and that might help. Beo, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example of the same kind of issue that you face, right? So when we wanted to do the stress anger management game, now, if we had gone it on our own, firstly, we would have had to fund the game ourselves. We have to pay to develop it on our own. In this case, the game itself, development was funded by the IMH and the research agencies, right? Now, the other benefit then is that the credibility, right? Because if we say that we can help your kids to lower their stress, parents will not believe us. But under IMH, which is the mental health institution in Singapore, recognized, right? So the credibility is there. The last part really is that reach that you mentioned about, because IMH has got a connection to all the counselors in all the schools in Singapore, right? So the moment we roll out this game, we would have marketers and people who, at least in Singapore, would be pushing the product out for us, right? So bottom line is that if you're doing something in the area of serious games, really look from the start for partners, sponsors, people who can give you that credibility and help you get out in the market as quickly as possible. Right?
So another question from the floor. Somebody in the audience wants to ask a question. Anybody? Okay, so I have a question of my own. Basically, I prepared questions just in case people don't ask. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about, and this is, I think one of the things that is very interesting, when we talk about the various verticals, I think we're, and we're talking about trying to figure out who holds the purse strings. What are some of the kinds of stakeholders that, Brenton sort of kind of mentioned, parents is one of the stakeholders, people who can have budgets to do this. Who are some of the kinds of people who are stakeholders in the various industries? So just sort of tick them off once, and then maybe we can talk about one of those in particular for every one of the industries. So can we start from, maybe just talk about a few of the stakeholders in education, and then for each of the industries, so arts and financial industry, etc.
When it comes to education, if you're talking about junior education, as in primary and secondary, the ultimate stakeholder is going to be the parent or the guardian. And whilst we talk about budgets coming through schools and schools making decisions, the vast majority of budget through the school and the stakeholder there is process and administration. But it's the outcome that is driven by the parent. And a lot of the things that schools try to do that's innovative, etc., if the parents aren't all for it, then the school might have to drop the idea. So the first stakeholder in educational games is going to be the parent. And this is sort of ties back to what I mentioned before about analytics. If you can provide the right kind of information back to a parent stakeholder that says, here's how and why things are working, then you're going to be able to meet that stakeholder's objective. And in education, they are typically the most important.
Jeremiah, in arts and culture, what kind of stakeholders are we talking about?
You'll often find that in most organizations there'll be either a department or a single person whose role is around learning and engagement, and that tends to be who we work with. Occasionally, if the project's done in partnership, or if it is tied to some form of funding application or research, then there's the organizations who sponsored it or provided the money for it. So we found that sometimes the cultural organization that we're working with is not necessarily the one putting up the money. And what the other party wants, sometimes it's just as simple as their logo on loads of pages. So they're a stakeholder, but sometimes not too annoying a stakeholder.
Karen, financial literacy, who are some of the kinds of, you mentioned banks, what are some of the kinds of stakeholders that you work with? And in banks, who, like banks are huge behemoths, so who in banks do you look at?
I think one thing I really want to point out is for anyone that you work with, the stakeholders, it's very important that you find a champion in there, in any company or corporates or government. There will definitely be someone who will be very passionate about the cause and their intentions are aligned. So for us, for banks, it would be someone actually high up. So we worked with, in DBS, was the head of the consumer banking. And it could also be the chief marketing officer. So, I think be authentic. I think that's one thing that I want to call out, that be authentic and be true to your purpose. And they will see that, and and those people who are champions will see that, and you'll find that your intentions are aligned. And for us also, is one of the things is also government. We work quite a lot with government, and that's actually for our lower income kids. So we actually do not just for the so-called middle-class families and all that, but we also work with the governments to roll out programs for lower income families.
What branch of the government are you working with?
That would be the family service, and also with the community. There is the ministers who are very passionate about financial literacy. So I would call out, actually I'm giving him credit. So Minister Lawrence Wong is someone that we work with, his constituency. So, yep.
Saying Beo, in hospitals, who are some of the people that game developers can talk to?
Okay, I guess in order for what we do to make sense, we don't really call it health care or clinical health, right? So it is really more wellness, so that the market is much bigger. Now, in terms of wellness, the stakeholders are tremendous. Even in Singapore, you'll find that a lot of different ministries, a lot of different groups. I think Pioneer Generation comes to mind, elder care centers and everything else. But what we did was that we felt that to be credible in wellness and health, we have to work with MOH and the healthcare people, right? So we spent about 1 year plus speaking to the doctors, head of departments and the head of the NHG groups to talk to them, convince them, and I guess hear what they wanted. And that's why we launched that health platform.
So with corporates in Playware, our experience has been we usually work with HR and talent development people within the organizations, because they are usually the ones with some budgets for training people. It depends also what you're trying to do. We've actually worked with marketing budgets and ad agencies as well. Oftentimes, the educational campaign that the corporate wants to run is external facing, and so that in that case it's the marketing. But I think the most effective in our industry has been, as Karen was pointing out, people who are championing a cause. So it's usually a business group within a corporate who wants to train their people about their practices and their processes. And so if you can work with a business group, you still have to work with HR, but at least you have that edge, that you have the people who have the specific domain working with you. I think we are almost out of time. Do we have time for another question or a couple of questions? Or? No? So we are out of time. So if you have questions, please feel free to approach us and talk to us specifically. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you for not walking out en masse. I hope we kept you entertained during lunch. Thank you, everyone, for being on the panel, and thank you, Casual Connect, for calling us here. Thank you.
All right, thanks.